You're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek, where we discuss the hidden layers and deeper meanings found in all the Star Trek TV series, movies, and more. And today we're discussing the original series episode, The Return of the Archons. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today on the panel are Father Cory Sticha. Hey, Father Cory.
How's it going?
And Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends. That's the number one way we grow this audience and keep the podcast going. So your sharing it with others is greatly appreciated. And the more folks that listen, the more community we have, the better the show is. And I want to tell you about another show on the StarQuest Network you are sure to enjoy called The Secrets of Movies and TV Shows. And you can find that wherever fine podcasts are found or at sqpn.com/secrets. So, as I mentioned, today we are discussing the original series episode, The Return of the Archons. And Jimmy, can you give us a recap of what goes on in this episode?
This week, the Enterprise visits a planet to find out what happened to the starship Archon, which disappeared 100 years ago. Sulu and another officer have beamed down to investigate, but when they beam Sulu back up, he's completely blissed out and talking strangely. So Kirk takes a much larger landing party down to investigate so that more people can be put in danger. They find a strangely calm, peaceful 19th century-like society where everybody acts tranquil and blissed out. But then everything goes haywire as the people throw a one-night violent party called Festival. In the wake of this, the landing party discovers that the society is run by a mysterious figure called Landru, who mind controls everybody and makes them blissed out all the time. 100 years ago, Landru pulled the Archon out of the sky and started mind-controlling its crew members. Kirk and the gang also make contact with a small underground that resists Landru, and that is waiting for more Archons, or people from the Federation, to return and overthrow Landru. When it comes time to do that, though, the members of the underground lose their courage, but Spock and Kirk take matters into their own hands. They discover that Landru is really a 6,000-year-old computer that was programmed by the original Landru. And for the first time in Star Trek history, Kirk talks the computer to death, freeing the civilization. The end.
All right. And Father Cory, your overall impression of this one?
Well, I always get a kick when you see in Star Trek or Mission Impossible when you have the stock Desilu set. You know, and of course, in this case, it's the stock Desilu set up as Old West, including with Old West garb that obviously came out of the Desilu wardrobes department, et cetera, et cetera. You know, it's pretty clear that this was meant to be kind of a cost-saving episode because they could use sets that already existed, including the dungeon, including the main street and stuff like that, instead of having to go to a location. It wasn't a bad episode. It was okay. You know, it was, you know, you got a little bit of the purge there with the festival, and you got the mind control people, and then the some people who resist the mind control and, you know, have a rebellion and stuff like that. But like Jimmy said, then you have, you know, Kirk using his faulty Kirk logic to talk the computer to death to end. So it was an okay episode.
How about you, Jimmy?
Well, this episode can be viewed from more than one perspective. There's a second way of looking at it that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So I'm going to partition that. I'm going to put that aside for now and just talk about viewing this episode as if it didn't have any other context. You know, not other Star Trek episodes where Kirk talks a computer to death and not other things. Just taking the episode on its own, I think it's enjoyable. It's got some interesting stuff. It has quite a number of interesting concepts in it. In fact, this actually, Gene Roddenberry had the plot outline for this episode, and it was considered as one of the plots they might film for the pilot, which ended up being The Cage, which actually has some similar themes to this. Mm. But in any event, I think it's a good, interesting story. Roddenberry did not end up writing this, fortunately. Instead, another veteran TV writer named Boris Sobelman took the plot outline and wrote the script, and I'm sure it is vastly better for that, because as Harlan Ellison explained, Gene Roddenberry can't write worth sour bird poop. But the story itself is an interesting one. It's an interesting culture. We have a lot of data that seems to not fit together initially, and they don't actually explain everything fully. Like Festival, they never really give us a full explanation of what that's about. But if you think about it, you can see what it's doing. It's effectively an outlet for emotions that this society is otherwise not allowed to feel. And so every so often in James Blish's adaptation of this, they say it's once a year, they have this night where they purge all these emotions by having this violent party. And then once purged of those emotions, they can lead their normal, peaceful, tranquil, blissed out lives. Also, I have to say, if you're going to mind control people, you may as well make it enjoyable for them. So, I would much prefer the blissed out. If any future mind controllers, I would much prefer the blissed out as opposed to the torturous mind control. So just be aware of that.
Yeah, you'll get further with fewer rebels if you bliss everybody out.
Yeah.
So I haven't seen this episode in a long time, probably since I was, much younger, and so didn't remember a lot. I remember the lawgivers, although for some reason in my head I thought they were called the Archons, and so this was a lot new. I did remember that the festival made a big impression on me as a kid. The adults freaking out and going wild was disturbing as a kid. So that was interesting to see. And then seeing it now, different aspects of it jumped out at me. And so we can get into that as we go. But I also kind of picked out that we've seen this set and we will see this set again in future episodes. This will be Organa in the future. I think this was definitely, I think this was also used in Miri. This was the set for the 50s analog of Miri. So you have these sets that show up a lot.
Again, this is the back lot of Desilu.
That's right.
They could just walk out of their studio, their studio building, and set up filming, a couple of blocks away.
An original series Star Trek had no problem basically just having Earth-like humans on other planets.
Oh, and parallel worlds. So they're like copies of Earth. Down to the continents.
Right. And, and just, the similar development, maybe later, maybe, that sort of thing. And so they didn't have to explain it. They didn't worry about it. They just were telling a story. And it's something a little bit refreshing about that. In our day, like people get all freaked out over Strange New Worlds, discontinuity with the original series. How will we ever resolve this? And it's like, well, no shade on anyone. No shade on anyone. But I know we've had this discussion.
I'd love them to encounter a parallel Earth down to the continents in Strange New Worlds and say, well, that's really weird. And it's highly improbable, but I guess its existence shows it can happen.
Right.
And just leave it as a mystery.
Right. And we're very, I think, as a 21st century, the 2020s viewers, we tend to want things to fit more as fans. We get very caught up in the details. But in this early stuff, it was less.
And the idea of a canon where you have this actual timeline canon is newer than TOS. I mean, it's been in Star Trek for most of its time. But it's newer than TOS that there's this strict canon that you have to follow. And that's something that kind of developed as Star Trek developed.
Also, the levels of realism in sci-fi have changed dramatically. Not Babylon 5, Battlestar Galactica, the remake, is very realistic compared to Star Trek, the original series. And Star Trek, the original series was in the mid-1960s, coming off the heels of the Twilight Zone. And that's why you have a lot of weird parallels and Twilight Zone-like logic, which was the standard for TV series that were science fiction at the time. Yeah.
So I just, I say all that to say I enjoy it for what it is. I like this episode. It had some very interesting Kirk moments and Spock moments, which I liked. And
oh, yeah. Like, for example, at the beginning of Festival, as soon as it hits 6 o'clock, this woman runs up to Kirk and plants one on him. And for once, he resists.
Yeah.
And it's like, then later you got him in the hotel and they're looking out you got these shots of Kirk looking out the window at Festival and scowling. And it's like just looks so jealous of all the people out there in festival.
By the way, worst Airbnb ever. Let's just throw it out there right now. Let's talk about this. So we have the opening where we have this cold open of Sulu and O'Neill on the surface. Jack O'Neill's great grandson, maybe, I don't know. But well, 1L, and they get, O'Neill runs off and eventually gets blissed out, absorbed is the phrase we get, and Sulu gets absorbed just before he gets beamed up. But then
they do by one of the lawgivers just pointing a staff at him, and he kind of like yanks his head back, and it's like he's got zapped under the chin or something, and now he's all blissed out.
Yep.
Yeah. George Takei was very effective at acting under controlled, possessed by other things, because we get him like that the swashbuckler later.
Stoned would be a good term.
That's a very good 60s term. But so when they first get down there, there's this. I wrote down mindless vacant contentment is the phrase, and I think I might have read that online. And I was thinking, if everybody on the planet is like this, how does anything get done? Just people wandering around. It's kind of interesting.
And that was an actual line from the episode where Kirk comments that they've got this mindless vacant contentment.
Okay.
Yeah, but I wouldn't. I assume you can mindless, vacantly, contentedly do your job. Mm-hmm. So presumably they have. I mean, we see all these shops.
Yeah.
Now they're closed during the festival, but presumably during the day, there's people in there you can go in and buy your buy your bread from the mindlessly blissful baker. You can go down and get money out of the bank from the mindlessly, vacantly blissful teller. You can go to the butcher and buy meat from him. You can, these people are running a society. They're just doing it in a really low key, happy way.
I just wonder if a society, just as a speculative, can a society actually work without people who tend to be more type A and driven and...
Well, that's Kirk's argument at the end.
Yeah.
But Landru says, I reserve creativity to me.
Mm-hmm.
So Landru's the one deciding, okay, you're going to be a baker and here's how you do your job. And you're going to be a butcher and here's how you do your job. And you're going to be a candlestick maker and here's how you do your job. And so then they all just do it.
Yeah, exactly. You got Landru mind controlling them all. So there's nothing to keep him from doing that,
Right.
Figure out who has the best skills to do what and letting them do it.
So then we get the red hour, which is this crazy bacchanalia or the purge if people want it.
It's also 6 p.m.
Right.
Yeah.
So, we would call that happy hour here on Earth.
6 p.m. to 6 a.m. is their festival. So it's all night. Because literally right at 6 a.m. they go back to normal.
Like a switch. And let's be clear what's going on here. Like this is 60s, kind of downplaying, but this is rape and pillage.
Yep.
There's lots of violence. They are running around with torches. Although we don't really see anything torched because they can't burn down the sets. Right. They also show, and this is an inconsistency in the plot or in the presentation. They show everybody in festival is having a great time. They are all grinning like crazy, and they're smooching and they're hugging and they're this is TV code for they're having sex.
Mm-hmm.
And then 6 a.m. they're all still fully clothed and they go back to normal.
Yeah,
and I can excuse that on TV censorship grounds. They're not going to get explicit about this at the time. But there's this one guy that we meet early on. He's the first guy to actually talk to Kirk's landing party. His name is Belar.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, he's got this really weird mode of speech that's unlike anybody else in the episode.
Yeah.
And I saw a comment once from the actor. I was reading a history of Star Trek, and the actor commented that he felt like an idiot because he had been led to believe this is like a New England society. And so he adopts this sort of New England accent. It's like, come for the festival, ya? And he's the only person that talks like that in the whole episode.
Right.
And so he did it because he thought he was being authentic to the part, but nobody else interpreted it that way. And so he felt like an idiot afterwards when he saw the episode. But anyway, when Red Hour hits, now he what he's doing in the plot is he's hooking them up with a place to stay.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells them there's this guy named Redger who has a rooming house down the street, and they run into Redger's daughter, Tula, and they're talking about you can go there to sleep off the festival. And then the Red Hour hits, and he says, "Come, Tula," and takes her by the hand, and they run off.
Mm-hmm.
And Tula is a willing participant in this. You know, she's not looking distressed. She's not looking afraid. She's looking enthusiastic. And then the next morning, she's back at her dad's house, and she's crying and being comforted, like she's just been raped. Mm-hmm. And we're meant to understand. In fact, one of the officers, a guy named Lindstrom, is irate and is talking to Redger about it was Beelar who did that. But that's inconsistent because everybody we see during festival itself is having a great time. And we get no indication of this is traumatic for people. This is like a release for people. And then they show Tula as a victim when she was an enthusiastic participant in the beginning. And it's like, how does this fit together? If you're a mind controlling computer, you want to let people go crazy, and you want to let people go crazy and have a good time. Why would you have this? I could see it making a dramatic choice either way, but they kind of make both dramatic choices and shove them together in a way that's inconsistent.
See, and I didn't see any inconsistency there because I didn't see that being them willing participants. I saw that this is still part of the mind control, because you see the people that were in the house that did not participate in it. They did not rush out to do it. They stayed in, they made the choice to stay in the house, to stay away from it. And so by showing Tula coming in despair, her dress was ripped and things like that. This wasn't willing. They might have looked like they were, but they weren't, so because
they were mind controlled into being Bacchanalian crazy.
Yeah, exactly. This was not a release of the mind control. And that's what they were trying to show. And maybe they didn't show it in a way that did it well, but that's what I got out of it. That no, it wasn't that this was a release of mind control. It was allowing them to release their emotions, but doing it in a way that was still controlled by Landrum.
No, that's what I got out of it too.
So
that he's mind controlling them into going crazy to release these emotions. And then he mind controls them in a different way. He's just shifting the mode of the mind control. Right. So they go back to normal, happy, passive mode in the morning. But if they all go back to normal, happy, passive mode in the morning, why doesn't Tula?
Because, again, like her dad is one of those that is resistant to the mind controlling. And so maybe that's that coming out, because they talk about that Rhaegar can't be mind controlled.
It's possible, but then I would appreciate it if they had told us that, because that Tula is also immune and has been faking it all this time.
Right.
That would make sense.
They're trying to convey, as you said, Jimmy, they're trying to convey the awfulness of the festival, but not spending a lot of time explaining
and that's
why this is why they're showing her this way, and they should have, I think. Yeah.
And that can be set down to
directorial choices.
Bad 60s writing, whatever, however you want to put it. But I think they showed it. Maybe it just wasn't as effective as it could have been.
Yeah. So speaking of things not as effective as they could have been, the props of the rocks and bricks bouncing around like foam Nerf balls. I just had to laugh at that.
I think they still use those rocks in TNG when the consoles explode. But anyways,
stop putting the rocks in the consoles. But that's a whole nother thing. And also another small detail: Spock apparently sleeps with his eyes open.
How about that?
So that's not creepy at all.
I like that they put that in. They don't say anything about it, but as it's come morning, Kirk's walking around. He's apparently been awake all night, and he walks past Spock's bunk, and Spock's got his eyes open, just laying there. And then he like wakes him up, and Spock startles awake.
Yeah. I like that choice by Nimoy too. Apparently Nimoy came up with that too, to have Spock be a Vulcans with their eyes open. That's very creepily alien.
Mm-hmm.
So they confront the lawgivers. Show up. This guy Tattletales.
We should say what the lawgivers are.
Yeah,
they're these individuals. They come in twos, and they wear robes, including cowls over their heads, and they carry these staves, which are hollow tubes, and they speak in a very robotic manner. So unlike everybody else who talks in this slow, tranquil, happy manner, the lawgivers are much more robotic in their speech. So it looks like they're under a different kind of control than the ordinary people. And all these people, by the way, are said to be members of the body.
Right.
And so there are different classes of people within the body. There's most people who get the more blissed out experience, and the lawgivers who are kind of like police enforcement agents or something, and they hunt down rebels, and they communicate directives from the leader, the head of the body, Landru, to ordinary people in some circumstances. But they're basically kind of like police, and they seem to be more robotic than everybody else. There
seems to be a third category too, which is older people like Rieger, Haycom, and Tamar, who they don't act all blissed out. I mean, Tamar is kind of a jerk, actually.
Yeah,
well,
he's kind of uptight.
Yeah, he's. I think you mean Haycom.
Haycom, right?
Haycom is a zealot.
Yes,
he's vicious in how he acts, and it does seem that older people are in a separate category too. They comment that at the beginning of festival, Rager and his two companions, Haycom and Tamar, comment on these men are young. They're not old enough to be excused from the festival. So apparently, when you get older, the control mechanism shifts, and you're not compelled to go into the festival. And then the next morning, when Rager learns that Kirk and his gang didn't go to the festival, and he says, "Then you're not of the body. You couldn't be." Because apparently, if you're a younger person, you're compelled to go do this. But, emotional regulation changes as you get older, and passions can cool. And so that would be why the older people don't need to go release their emotions in the festival this way.
Right. And they don't act all blissed out the rest of the time either. Maybe they don't need that.
I think
much.
that's a flaw in the writing, though.
Yeah.
Well, again, they mentioned with Rager that for whatever reason, genetics or whatever, that he can't be blissed out. He can't be mind controlled.
But Haycom,
that's why he's part of the resistance.
He does fake it though. Like when they're walking down the street, he's pretending to be all happy.
Yep.
Yeah. So when
I think and Tamar kind of acts happy. The one who doesn't is Haycom.
Right.
Yeah.
And the reason he doesn't is because he's immediately suspicious. Right. And one of the things that we do see is that if a member of the body begins to suspect that you're not of the body, they have very negative reactions. They get really suspicious, and they can start yelling and become violent. And McCoy later, after he gets absorbed and he starts to suspect Kirk is not of the body, McCoy has this awesome freak out.
Yeah.
Where he's yelling and calling Kirk a traitor and yelling
strangling
for the
him.
guards. And he starts strangling Kirk. And Kirk is like, "I don't want to hurt you, Doc."
Because he could. Speaking of the body, I mean, it's almost like an immune response. And the lawgivers are, the white blood cells of the
hunter-killer cells.
Yeah. So, it's kind of a little bit like that. The body turns on you when you're an alien to it.
Well, we see, too, that they're directly controlled by Landru, where, like when Kirk challenges them and they kind of they don't know how to respond, where they kind of face each other.
Right.
Like it's a computer trying to figure out what to do next, what the next step is.
Right. They notice that like it's a compulsory involuntary stimulus to action is I think how Spock puts it.
Yeah. Thank you, Captain Redundant. Compulsory and involuntary mean the same thing.
Right. And yeah, it's a computer confronted with unexpected input. And so what does it do? It needs to.
And that's where Kirk and Spock realize that Landru isn't a person, but a thing, a computer.
Yeah. They start to suspect it, at least in the beginning. Here. Now let's talk about Lindstrom, the sociologist, the officer, who's really bad at being a Starfleet officer because he spends his entire time obsessing over this young woman and having outbursts that keep getting them into trouble.
Yeah,
there was
send him back
originally
to the ship.
There was in the penultimate script there was a subplot of him falling in love with a Baden woman, presumably Tula. But they dropped that. But that his continual obsession about what happened to Tula is maybe a remnant of that subplot.
Right.
But he's totally insubordinate. As like, dude, you're on a planet in a dangerous environment. You should be letting the captain take the lead and not intruding yourself in this outbursty manner to the locals.
Right, like the very stalwart Mr. Leslie, who is the red shirt that survives, by the way. Let's just give him the credit. Mr. Leslie survives throughout TOS as a red shirt on away missions, and it's because he keeps his head down, does his job, and doesn't wander off.
Well, in Lindstrom survived. He just got left behind.
Yeah, he did get left behind.
At the end, he gets stuck on the planet. Willingly, but still.
But he's lucky because he's a serious security liability in this situation.
Yeah. Although luckily the body apparently doesn't run, so when the away team is trying to get away from the mob that's coming for them, the mob just kind of shuffles along like zombies.
They use slow and steady wins the race tortoise tactics of we're just going to swarm you and you won't be able to ultimately get away.
Yep.
Yes. Yep. So the
and that also incidentally, it's another mode of telepathic control. When the lawgivers show up at Redger's house and they say, you guys are not of the body, so you need to be absorbed, so come down to the absorption chambers with us. And Kirk says no, and they don't know what to do. And so they then turn and face each other, and we hear this whistling, vibrating science fiction noise, and we're told they're communing with Landru. So they're getting new instructions from Landru. And then when they say, it is clear you simply did not understand, you will accompany us to the absorption chambers. And Kirk again says no and yanks away the guy's rod.
Give me back my stick.
Hands it to Spock and says, it's just a hollow tube, Captain. It's amazing. Now, there's also a plot hole here. If they could absorb Sulu just by zapping him with the rod, why don't they do that here? Why do you got to go down to the absorption chambers?
Right.
So that doesn't really make sense. And I don't see an easy fix for that.
No.
But then they quickly leave the house, and then we hear the science fiction noise again, and everybody in the street freezes. And Rager says it's Landru, he's summoning the body. So there's this additional mode where you're like plugged into Landru Central that the lawgivers have when they need new instructions. And Landru can also initiate this mode of contact over an area and take more direct control of the people in the area and direct them to particular goals. So it seems like normally members of the body are in their blissed out state, they're going about their business, they're following their normal instructions without immediate control of every little behavior.
Right.
You know, they're just following their programming. I'm going to be a baker today, so that's what I'm doing. But when Landru needs to, he can assume more direct control of everybody and coordinate them to go after some goal using a massive tactical, bunch of people solution to a problem.
Right. Right. And at this point, I kind of want to talk about the timeline here because, it's the whole Landru thing began 6,000 years previously. We kind of get this at the end.
Apparently, although I like the fact Rager says nobody knows for sure. Some say as long as 6,000 years ago. Right.
And so this has been the way things have been for this time. And clearly, this was a more advanced civilization the Batons had. And Landru has kind of made them into a more simple civilization. and this was all done in response to violence and war. And it's interesting. The Vulcans responded to a warlike society by imposing logic, and this was
repressing emotion.
This one is similar in that it's repressing emotion, but
all
doing
but one.
it through what's that?
All but one.
All but right.
Bliss.
Except joy. So and then that's when the Starship Archon, which showed up probably in the Enterprise era, right?
Yeah,
That
it would, according to the Star Trek timeline, it showed up in 2167, which is just 6 years after the founding of the Federation. And when Star Trek Enterprise was on the air, I was really hoping they were going to let us see the Archon and go, hey, here's that doomed ship.
Yep.
Nice to see it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. We might have, in the 5th season, might have got that. And then we also at this point get a ticking clock. Landru has got the Enterprise in a tractor beam and heat rays.
Heat beams, yeah.
Yep. And so they can't turn off the shields, or the ship would be, it's powerful enough that it would incinerate the ship. Yep. But they have to put all power, including engine power, into the shields, and thus they're falling out of orbit. So we have a 12-hour ticking clock. And so as they're running away, they find Lieutenant O'Neill, who's of the body now, and
he's
Kirk
unconscious though.
Yep. And Kirk won't leave him behind. Redger is like, he's of the body now. If you take him, Landru's got going to be able to see us wherever we go. He'll be able to find us, which is a valid concern
if he wakes up. Yes.
Yep. And so Kirk eventually, after much prodding, I have to say, eventually tells McCoy, keep him under, give him a sedative and keep him out.
Yep. And then Kirk immediately, because they've gotten to a hiding place by this point that's used by the Landru Underground.
Yep.
And the anti-Landru Underground, which we learned is arranged in threes. And Tamar, the guy who got zapped dead earlier on by one of the lawgivers, was Redger's contact, so he doesn't know who the third member of their triad is, which is weird. But anyway, they've got to this hiding place, and Redger finally manages to convince Kirk to keep O'Neill unconscious. So he has McCoy give him a shot to keep him out. And then Kirk immediately blows it by making a phone call to the Enterprise, and that triggers scanning beams that immediately locate them, and Landru shows up in hologram and tells them their lives are going to be really great from now on, and he sonics them into unconsciousness. So Kirk himself made the decision. It wasn't O'Neill that got them found, it was Kirk.
Right. So Landru says, you have come to a world without hate, without fear, without conflict, no war, no disease, no crime, none of the ancient evil. Landru seeks tranquility, peace for all, the universal good. And I'm thinking except during the festival.
Exactly.
There's no peace and tranquility then. Right?
From Landru's point of view, the festival is a necessary evil for young people to let them get it out of their system in a controlled way, so the rest of their time they can have all this greatness going on.
Yeah, like the sowing your wild oats. So what's the Amish thing? Where the kids go off for a year. It kind of sounds like that, like sowing your wild oats. So I note, as usual, Kirk is the last to succumb to the knockout. Mm-hmm. And the first to wake, because Kirk, which is great. He's the hero. Let's let him do that.
They should let Captain Pike do that more.
Yeah, that's right. And this is so that we find ourselves. This was a little confusing because they were hiding in a little dungeon area and wake up in a little dungeon area, but it's a different dungeon.
It's the same set, but it's been redressed and shot from a different angle.
I think it was a bit of a directorial mistake. They should have had more of a difference. I knew it was a different dungeon, but I could see where that could be confusing to people. So they're in this new dungeon. McCoy and one of the other the security guys had been taken off. I'm not sure if it was Leslie or not, but they come back.
It wasn't. It was the other one.
Yeah, the other red shirt, and they're blissed out. They're absorbed, and Kirk gets dragged off. We have some other things happening, but Kirk gets dragged off and encounters the third man of Rage's cell, Marplan.
But we don't know that's who he is initially. We see a changeover in the absorption chamber one of the lawgivers is getting off shift, and this new guy in an orange robe, because normally the robes are brown, this new guy in an orange robe is getting put on shift. And he like says to the other guy, "Happy communing to you." And he goes, and the other lawgiver goes off. And this is just as Kirk's being brought in. He's strapped into a machine by these little mechanical arm restraints that automatically clamp on him. And then the next time we see him, they're bringing Spock in, they're bringing Kirk out, and Kirk has apparently been absorbed because he's like, to Spock, he's like, "Joy, peace, and tranquility to you, friend." And so it looks like Kirk has been absorbed, but then once they get Spock in the device, the new lawgiver in the orange robe says, "Hi, my name is Marplon. I'm the third member of the Secret Underground. Your friend is unharmed. Act like him now."
Yeah. And watching Spock try to act blissed out is funny. Again, Nimoy does a good job of
very low-key bliss here.
Yeah. Joy be with you, peace and contentment. He does the best he can, I suppose.
Kind of keeps his head down so they can't look at him in the eye or anything like that. Yeah.
Yes. So so there's an interesting conversation back in the cell, and they're trying to have this conversation where McCoy can't overhear them because he's, the spy among us. And they're really too close. It's like McCoy's going to overhear this guy.
Yep.
You can see him in the background being suspicious. Like, what are you talking about over there? That doesn't look of the body.
Yeah.
But Spock comes up with a good point. He says, "This is a soulless society, Captain. Has no spirit, no spark. All is indeed peace and tranquility. The peace of the factory, the tranquility of the machine, all parts working in unison. A society run by a computer, essentially, run for efficiency."
But he doesn't say that. And Kirk instead says, "Then you're thinking the same thing I am. The plug must be pulled." And they don't actually say Landru is a computer at this point.
Right.
And Spock says, "What?" And Kirk says, "Landru must die."
Right.
And then we get the first reference ever. By the way, this is also the first episode where Scotty is in charge of the Enterprise.
Oh, yeah.
But then we get the first reference ever to the Prime Directive. And Spock says, "But the Prime Directive prevents us from interfering in other societies, Captain." And Kirk says, "That only applies to societies that are living and growing. This one is stagnant because of what Landru is doing."
Right. That's
so we get Kirk's first Prime Directive violation.
Yep. Well, and in fact, that's an interesting distinction that he makes here that kind of gets forgotten later on, which is the Prime Directive only applies to societies that are living and growing, which means a judgment call on the part of the captain who's involved.
Except I think this is Kirk's rationalization. I don't think that in the Prime Directive as it's written, and we actually have a kind of semi-canonical text of it, but it won't say don't interfere if the society is living and growing. Right. It's going to say something like don't interfere in the natural development of a society. And Kirk is rationalizing what he's doing by saying, "Oh, this one isn't naturally developing, so I get to do this."
And I think an argument can be made, too, is that this was a society that was far more technologically advanced than it is now. So you could say that at one point they may have had warp. They may have had these because they had the light panel that you would find on a starship and things like that.
I actually got some of those. I meant to put them on Facebook, but a while back I got some light panels that, could for like light therapy purposes. I thought I'd try them and see if they worked. And it's basically a glowing panel. And I thought, hey, it's like Return of the Archons. I meant to take photos and put them on Facebook, but I don't know if I still have them anymore.
It's a lot easier to do that nowadays with just LEDs at the bottom of the panel to light it.
Yeah. But I got one lighting me up right now in the video. So we have this exchange about the Prime Directive, and then Kirk is trying to get Rager and Marplon to lead the rebellion, to rise up, and they're like, I think I've changed my mind. It's a bad idea. And
this is psychologically, this is fascinating because they've spent their whole lives in fear of Landru, and they've been hoping these Archons are going to show up and overthrow him. And now, wait, you want me to do this? You don't want to just take it yourselves and do it? And they start having serious reconsideration issues. And, Marplon is like about to weep, and he's saying we've destroyed ourselves because of everything we've said. Rager has a crisis of conscience and goes the other way. And he says, no, I was wrong. I submit. I bear myself to the will of Landru.
Yep.
And it's like, wow, that's psychologically very complex.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and I think this is really good writing.
Yeah.
Because having their regrets and having Redger flip, and he's immune to control, but he's ideologically, he's just changed sides and become a Landruite.
Yeah.
And Kirk tells him, snap out of it, start acting like men, which is a,
and it shows it's easy to be kind of a rebel when you're just kind of under the surface and there's no real consequences to it, and you can kind of hide, and it's more just rebellion of gossip than it is a rebellion, actual active rebellion. But now once you get to that point where all of a sudden, if we do this, things are going to change, and we won't have the ability to control how it goes.
Mm-hmm.
That's very different. Yeah,
for them, even if they were in some danger prior to this situation, because they could always be caught, and except for Redger, absorbed. This new situation that is being proposed is far more dangerous. And so by comparison, living in Landru society looks to them like this is the safer option.
Yeah.
I feel like that's been historically has happened before to people living under oppression, and when the time came to rise up, there were some who was like, no, this is fine. Like, I'm okay living in the underground. I don't want to now put my life on the line to change things. That's a whole nother level of commitment that I'm not prepared for.
I don't like those. I don't like those taxes that the Brits are making us pay. But I really don't want to overthrow the king either.
Yeah, there you go. Right.
There are also incidents where, like, with other species besides our own, like horses. Horses spend a lot of their time in their stall in the barn, and they associate it with that's where I'm safe. Mm. And there are accounts of the barn catching on fire and the horses trying to run back to their stalls where they feel safe, even though the barn is obviously on fire and the horse perceives the danger. But I want to get back to that place of safety.
Mm. Right. So Kirk goes to confront Landru, where he will eventually confront the computer that is Landru, and we have some very interesting dialogue here. Kirk says, the machine was programmed with Landru's knowledge, but not his wisdom, not his soul, and there's
that's an important line that will come back later,
right? Because computers can have knowledge, but they can't have wisdom, which is a important element that we need to recognize.
Not unless they're a Sun-class android.
right.
Yeah.
But in our day and age, we're with the rise of machine learning, AI sort of things, we have to remember this. And the whole question of the good of the body becomes the key to Kirk's argument.
Because what Landru says when they start talking to him is it's really sad. And Landru is coming across, the hologram of him is coming across as really sympathetic. It's like you've got this, you brought infection to the body, and it's really sad and it's a tragedy, but I'm going to have to kill you and everybody who even knew about you.
Yeah, right. And I hate to do that, but you got to do it. Because
the memory of the body must be purified. The goal of the body, the good of the body is the absolute, that's our prime directive. He even uses prime directive. And Spock says to Kirk, that's the key, Captain, the good of the body. And so Kirk starts into this dialogue where he's going to talk the computer to death by arguing that actually, rather than helping the good of the body, Landru is harming the good of the body. And so it needs to terminate itself to allow the body to flourish. Now, in principle, that's a perfectly reasonable argument, but Kirk proceeds to execute it in one of the dumbest ways ever. Because what he tells he asks Landru to define the good of the body. And Landru does. And this is a good move rhetorically, because Kirk needs to know how Landru is conceptualizing the good of the body if he's going to turn that against him. And Landru says, well, it's the harmonious continuation of the body. And, it's the body continues to live. It's peaceful. It's harmonious. It's all this stuff. And And if that's how Landru conceives of the good of the body, Landru's doing just fine because the body is all those things right now. But Kirk needs to argue that Landru's actually harming the body. And what he says is the body is dying. You are destroying it. And that's actually not true. The body's doing just fine.
Yeah. But
Kirk needs to argue that in hyperdramatic TV terms that the body is dying. And to make his point, he raises his voice because, of course, when you raise your voice, that means what you're saying is true. and Landru is like, no, the body is doing just fine. And Kirk says, so what are you doing to justify to fulfill the individual potential of all of the members of the body? You know, you're not letting them be creative and stuff. You're just running everything. You got your blissed out mind control baker, but he's not going to invent any new cupcakes that way. And he's just going to make the same old cupcakes, which people are perfectly blissed out and happy to have. So Landru thinks about it and he says, you know, the body exists, it's thriving, but I reserve creativity to me. And Kirk is like, without creativity, there is no life. The body dies. As if that proves anything. You know, and it makes no sense. But Landru, because the plot requires it, starts to buy in to this idea that he is actually causing the body to die, even though that's clearly false. And he kind of gets trapped in a loop where he starts calling for the dead biological Landru to help him. He's going, Landru, help me, help me, help me. And at this point, a couple of lawgivers come in and they're like, what are we supposed to do? And Spock comments that they're without guidance, possibly for the first time in their lives, which is, wow, that's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
And ultimately Landru self-destructs.
So I want to go back to what Kirk says is he says, without freedom of choice, there's no creativity. Without creativity, there's no life. And freedom of choice is loaded these days. And you would maybe replace that with free will. Without free will, there is no creativity. I'm not sure creativity, like you said, I'm not sure creativity is the best argument, but without free will, there is no love. There's no true love. And without true love, there is no life. And I think that would have been the better argument, that you can't.
I think he needs to get off the life subject. The body is clearly alive. It's not under any threat. It's not literally dying. You can argue Landru is harming the body, but by suppressing everybody's free will and creativity.
Right.
But that's a much more sophisticated argument than they want to get into in this episode. Right. So the body dies.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it's they're happy and blissed out and equivalent to, you know, a late 1800s Old West scenario, but they're technologically they've reverted so far because of it, and they won't go forward, but they're still blissed out in it. So they're happy there. I know people that would love to live back in the 1800s Old West. And if I put on my Captain Picard hat, it's like, okay, they used to be an advanced society and they chose to go back to this. And who's to say it's wrong to choose to live at a lower level of technological development than what otherwise would be possible? But people can legitimately choose to become hippies and, go off the grid.
But you have to argue that loss of free will is the problem.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That it's not about living in peace or living without violence, quote, with an asterisk, or living blissed out, because that's not free will. That's not living in a sense, in the metaphorical sense.
And then my other Captain Picard hat as the Prime Directive absolutist that is willing to hinge an entire movie on saving 300 people who were actually members of the same culture but have chosen to live as hippies in a technologically backward area. I'm going to say, okay, but who are we to judge what happened in their society 6,000 years ago? Maybe it was all voluntary. Maybe Landru said, hey, I've got this great new absorption thing. It's going to make our lives perfect. Come down and get absorbed. And in which case the society might have freely chosen it. And even if they didn't freely choose it, even if he imposed it on them, who am I to disrupt this entire society that's functional?
Yeah, well,
just for some abstract benefits that I would like it to have.
This is the argument of whether the Prime Directive is moral at all, which...
Never mention that subject. Yeah, not if you want to go anywhere in your Starfleet career.
Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, I think there is an objective good, and, yeah, I think the absolutist position is wrong, but that's a whole nother discussion. So now might be the time to talk about the bigger thing here, which is what this story really is about.
Yeah.
Now, before you get into yours, for me, when I was watching it, I was thinking this is a rejection of communist socialism, given the 60s context, communism and socialism, individuality over ideologies that suppress everyone for the good of the whole.
You have a worker's paradise here.
Right.
Yep.
And that we'd be better off in the free West, so rejecting either fascist or socialist, or oppressive regimes. So that was my take on maybe the bigger moral. But Jimmy, you might have had a different one.
Yeah, this is something I've been aware of for a long time. Gene Roddenberry has a tendency in his stories, the plots that scratched him where he itched the most were ones that involved religion. And so we have all these stories where they go and they meet God, represented under some guise, and God is a computer, or he's crazy, or he's a computer and he's crazy, and he's ultimately not all that's cracked up to be. And we have this great humanistic atheological triumph when Kirk and the gang bring down God. And this happens over and over again.
What does God need with a starship?
That's a classic example, although Roddenberry actually hated that one because he had wanted to do that plot and he wasn't allowed to. And then that upstart Bill Shatner gets to do it.
Yep.
But there are all these others. There's the Apple, there's
Apollo,
this one, there's
who mourns for Adonis.
Who mourns for Adonis, there's V'ger. This just keeps happening over and over. Also, it happens in the second pilot, where No Man Has Gone Before, where you have Elizabeth Daner and Gary Mitchell become gods, and they're not all that. And you even have some elements of this in the original pilot, The Cage, where Captain Pike is tortured by a vision of hell, which is referred to as a tale he once heard from Earth mythology. And so we've got this persistent anti-religious theme. So let's look at what we got here. The body. Okay, if you've read your New Testament, one of the prominent themes is the body of Christ, which includes all the members of the church who are absorbed by baptism. And the head of the body is Jesus Christ. So Landru is a Jesus Christ surrogate. He's even, his dress in the hologram is reflected on Christian artwork. Commonly, Jesus is depicted as wearing a blue undertunic and a red overtunic. Mm-hmm. The blue undertunic symbolizes his eternal nature, and the red overtunic symbolizes his human nature. So you've got the duality of those two natures. Now, depending on the color tinting that you're seeing on your screen, Landru's may actually look like a purple undertunic and an orange overtunic, but it's basically the same thing. This is inspired by Christian art. Then you have the lawgivers who are running around in choir robes and monk's robes. Marplon's looks like it was literally bought off the shelf at a religious supply store. So you have this very clear religious iconography for these guys. They're meant to be monks and priests, who, of course, communicate the will of Jesus Christ to the members of Jesus's body. And they also carry the staffs, which are a little bit reminiscent of some, long form crucifixes that you would perhaps see a bishop carrying. Then we've got the ordinary members of the body who superficially act blissful and super happy, just like Christians are supposed to act in a certain stereotype of Christianity, particularly in Puritanism. But wow, will they turn vicious on you if you ain't one of them. And they're also secret hypocrites because even though they pretend to be all moral and pure all the time, secretly they purge it out and they have equivalents of the festival. not in an organized way, but in a disorganized way. And so the festival reveals what hypocrites Christians really are, because we all have primal needs, Gene Roddenberry in particular, that are not going to be fulfilled in a puritanical society. And so it's just on element after element with this. And I haven't even covered all of them, but this is a religious allegory. And that's why I wanted to say at the beginning for my review, for my take on it, that if we consider it just as an episode without any context, not including other Star Trek episodes that are similar, and not including broader societal context, I think it's a fun episode. But once you see the religious allegory nature of this, it's just Gene Roddenberry ranting on religion again. And that could spoil it for you. I mean, I'm irked by it, but it doesn't completely spoil it for me because I'm not threatened by Gene Roddenberry's religious rantings. So I can partition those and go, he's just being a jerk. And I know this scratches him, but where he itches, but I don't really care about his religious allegory thing. I can appreciate the story apart from that.
See, I saw it more puritanical than, specifically all Christianity and in the Catholic Church is more. I joked before that, those Franciscans running around in their robes, but
it actually should be Dominicans because they're functioning as the Inquisition.
Exactly.
That's what, yeah.
So it should have been white robes instead of brown robes, but they look more like Franciscan robes. But it definitely, with the kind of the idea of actually being more, New England style with the one character who took on the kind of this quasi New England accent, it seemed more puritanical, and the garb too was a little bit more like that. Although again, like the men's outfits were more Old West style, something you'd see Wyatt Earp wearing or somebody like that, or
Philadelphia 19th century style. It can fit with that too. I mean, they weren't wearing cowboy hats and chaps.
No.
Right.
There's also a line that Landru has in his final speech to them where he's saying, "Despite my efforts to save you." So, okay, that's what Landru's ideology is. He wants to save people. That's a little Jesus-y, don't you think? Also, the communication with Landru is described as communing, which is another important term in Christianity. I think you're right, Father. I think this is a mix of about puritanicalism. Gene Roddenberry, growing up in, the mid-20th century, America is a Protestant country, at least dominantly. And there were a lot of people in America who had a puritanical background, Puritanism being a form of Protestantism that originated in England. And the idea was that the church needs to be purified of Romish Catholic elements. And so that's how it got the name Puritanism, because they wanted the church to be purified. And so they were anti-Catholic, but they had this very outwardly clean, wholesome image, but also a reputation as being horrible prudes and hypocrites, by their critics at least. That was this kind of the stereotype of a Puritan. And so Puritans were like, for people who didn't like Christianity, Puritanism was one narrative that they would have available to them as something I don't like about Christianity. The other was, those Catholics and their awful Inquisition. Yep. So in this episode, let's smash them together and have Catholic evil inquisitors running over this Protestant hypocritical Puritan society.
Well, and to be fair, Puritans had their own version of the Inquisition as well.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they could
not
be
as
even
iconic,
more ruthless.
Not as iconic, though, as the Catholic one.
But nobody expects a Spanish Inquisition, so.
Nobody.
You beat me to it. So
I knew it was coming.
Yeah, it had to come out. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the last scene on the bridge, Kirk and Spock, the patented, Kirk and Spock.
Yeah.
There are several things about that are of note.
Yeah.
Kirk mentions, that Spock marvels at the feat of engineering, and frankly, a 6,000-year-old computer that kept running is quite a feat of engineering, directing the lives of millions of human beings. And Kirk says, but only a machine that had only his, couldn't have his Landru's wisdom, his compassion, understanding, his soul. And Spock says, predictably metaphysical.
I wanted to comment on that line because they hit this twice. in the episode.
Mhm.
Landru could give the machine his knowledge, but not his wisdom in the first case. And then in the second case, Landru could give the computer his knowledge, but not his wisdom, his compassion, his understanding, his soul. And so even though they haven't established in this episode that Landru was a good guy, we're led to believe by Kirk's dialogue that Landru was a really good guy and he was genuinely wise and compassionate and understanding. But this thing that grew out of his work is bad because he couldn't imbue it with his true good qualities. And I think that's part of the religious allegory too. Because you'd have a lot of people in the mid-20th century who would say, oh, Jesus was a good man, he was a good and wise teacher, and so forth, but Christianity bad.
Right.
And,
still hear that, yeah.
And so I think that's part of it as well. It also may be providing a little bit of heat shield for anybody who recognizes the allegory by throwing in a couple of respectful statements that would apply to the historical Jesus and allow a separation between the historical Jesus as a good guy and the later Christianity as a bad thing.
Well, you still see that mindset with people who say, well, I don't need religion to have a relationship with Jesus, or I don't need religion to be spiritual, or something like that, where, there's Christian religion is bad, but what Jesus taught is good. We like what he did and we like what he taught. We can know him, but this Christian religion, which, spoiler, Jesus created, he left for us.
Right.
We don't need that.
They also get a report in that scene. Oh, and Kirk compliments Mr. Spock and tells him,
You'd be a good computer.
You'd be a good computer. And Spock is, why, thank you, Captain. That's very kind of you.
And the flutes of humor.
We also get a report from the surface where Lindstrom has been left behind, and he's saying it's certainly more interesting than it was before. Today we've had several domestic quarrels and 2 knockdown dragouts. I was like, okay, you're celebrating spousal abuse there, Mr. Lindstrom.
Yeah.
Well, domestic quarrels,
no, I know, but 2 knockdown dragouts that suggest spouses are actually coming to physical blows.
Oh, I didn't take it as spouses. I just took it as people fighting.
People just be, neighbors or whatever.
Well, in the context of, in the context of domestic quarrels, I took it as the trope of husbands and wives fighting physically, which was a subject that was open for humor in the past. The image of the wife with the frying pan who's just brained her husband with it and stuff like that.
Yeah. So we can't talk about the Return of the Archons without also mentioning another place where Beta 3 shows up, which is the Lower Decks first season finale episode, No Small Parts, which starts with them back at Beta 3, the Cerritos being there, and Captain Freeman having to tell them, "What, you went back to worshiping Landru? What's wrong with you people?" So that was
and that's even though they play it for comedy. If you had spent your whole life in a blissed out state and now that's gone, you might want to return to that state. Lots of people might want to return to that state.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's only just the beginning, and also we have a Mariner handing out art supplies to the kids for their creativity, which was fun.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, what you'd be dealing with is psychological withdrawal symptoms on a societal scale.
Well, that's a note I had on this one, which was that suddenly all of these people would be having to make decisions for themselves about everything.
Well, and we talk about it, but there really is analogy for drugs too. People who maybe they get on drugs and they get heavily addicted to it, and for whatever reason or another they get clean. They get off the drugs, and that's always a temptation for them to go back. And a lot of people do fall back, drugs or alcohol or whatever.
And the drug aspect is part of this episode, but there's an even more on the nose episode about it coming up. This side of paradise.
Right. Speaking, by the way, you mentioned you referred to the Star Trek Insurrection. That is our next discussion, by the way, next week, as folks listen to this.
And I disagree with one thing, that Picard was trying to save the 300 people. No, he was trying to save his girlfriend. And the rest of the people just came with him.
He had the hots for her. All right. Final thoughts on this episode, though, Father Cory?
I wonder if this episode played a part of the development of the Borg later when they were doing the writing, because Lander at one point says, "You will be absorbed. Your individuality will merge into the unity of good. In your submergence into the common being of the body, you will find contentment, fulfillment. You will experience the absolute good." And of course, the Borg say, "We are the Borg. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile."
Yeah.
Very similar ideas, although one being obviously a technological control as part of the Borg and the other being the mind control. But I wonder if that isn't a coincidence. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
I think it may have. Another thing that I think is in play is when they initially introduced the Borg, they portrayed assimilation as a horrific experience.
Mhm.
We see Captain Picard crying as he's being assimilated. But the problem is that's just torture. And they don't want the Borg to look like they're all just they're experiencing constant torture mind control. And so in more recent times, they've talked about getting blissed out as a Borg, even though that makes no sense and is inconsistent with the torture mind control that they've established and are trying to go for with the body horror.
Right.
So I think that the blissed out mind control is something that's kind of been introduced to the Borg inconsistently, but is also reminiscent of Return of the Archons and this side of paradise.
Yep.
So, Jimmy, do you have any other final thoughts on this one?
Nothing significant. There's a particular moment after Dr. McCoy has been absorbed and Kirk and Spock have been brought back to this holding cell. And I like how McCoy, when he's brought back, is like, "We were told to wait here, friends."
Yeah.
Okay. But Kirk and Spock are starting their conversation, and McCoy is in the background, and he's kind of listening to him, and he's getting a little suspicious, and so Kirk starts spouting this peace and joy rhetoric back at him, and Leonard DeForest Kelly has this acting that it's just, this particular moment just comes across to me as hilariously cheesy. So Kirk has just said, like, "Joy to you, friend." And McCoy gets this broad smile on his face and says, "And peace and harmony. Are you of the body?" And something about the way he says it, which I can't really reproduce, it just looks like, and he's got this expectant look on his face. And I can't help but imagining his next line being, "Do you want a cookie?"
Yeah. It's very, I didn't mention it in the episode, but it is in our discussion, but it came across very cult-like. But of course, the popular conception of cults and that sort of thing is still in the future from when this was made, so the 70s and 80s, really. I mean, there was communes and the drug culture and the hippie culture that it resembles a little bit, but the cult-like aspects.
Charles Manson hadn't happened yet. And now I don't use the term cult because I find it adds heat rather than light.
Sure.
Yeah.
But there were, minority religious movements like Krishnaventa and there were quite a number of them, but you didn't have the big famous ones that you did later.
Right. So it wouldn't have been in the popular consciousness for that.
All right. One more quick thing that
sure.
If Rieger looked familiar, if you watched a lot of movies from or TV shows from the 60s into the 80s, you might recognize him. The actor is Harry Towns, and he's one of those actors that was very prolific as a character actor. He was always the second cast, the guest star on a lot of things, again, from like the early 60s up till the early 80s. So he was everywhere, and he was in a lot of things if you look him up on IMDb. So you've probably seen him in one thing or another.
I should probably add then Tamar, which was the underground guy that got killed, played by John Lormer.
Yeah,
he was in the cage as the imaginary Vena's dad in that one. So yep. So he shows up one more time in original series too. So
and he's in a lot of other 1960s TV series too.
Yeah, that's the fun thing is you see in these folks, sort of like Doctor Who. You see these faces all over the place that you recognize.
Well,
All right.
then that's kind of like the Vancouver actors that you see in like 90s sci-fi. They're like in everything.
That's right. That's right. So, well, as we wrap up, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make it possible for us to create the secrets of Star Trek, including Bernadette O., Elizabeth L., Christopher S., Darren R., and Daniel S. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue the secrets of Star Trek and all the shows at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. And we'd also like to thank Victor Lambs, who edited this episode. So we'd love to know what you thought of the return of the Archons. You can let us know by commenting on the show at sqpn.com/trek, our Facebook page, facebook.com/StarQuestMedia. Send an email to trek@sqpn.com or visit our StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord. And you can watch The Secrets of Star Trek on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/StarQuestMedia, where you can also leave a comment. We'll be back next time when we'll be discussing, like I mentioned, the movie Star Trek Insurrection. Until then, Jimmy Akin, thank you for joining me and sharing The Secrets of Star Trek.
Thank you. Joy to you, friend. Peace and contentment. It is the gift of Landru.
And Father Cory Sticha, thank you as well.
I think we just need to pull the plug. Thanks, Dom.
You speak very strangely, friend. Are you not of the body?
Yeah. and once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to The Secrets of Star Trek on StarQuest. And remember, freedom is never a gift. It has to be earned.